I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video. Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be doing a no-spoiler review for Perdido Street Station by China Mieville. This book has been recommended to me multiple times, many times, definitely up there with like Lies of Locke Lamora as books that people want me to read. I think it took up 8 slots on my Patreon wheel at one point, and I have finally read it. And I have never felt so conflicted about any book I have ever read before. And that goes for many reasons, because of the style, because of some of the choices in the plot, because of some of the shortcomings and notable critiques that you can make of this book. Because even though I feel conflicted, even though there are faults, I loved this book. And I think that the book actually plays with its faults to really give it a stylized, grimy feel. And that's kind of what this book has going for it, is a feel and in a vibe. And that is grimy in its setting, it's grimy in its writing, even though the writing is actually quite beautiful. It has like a chaotic note to it, and really, will paint this beautiful picture, but the picture has mud and crap all over it. That's kind of how it feels. It's very stylized, and I think China Mieville is a fabulous writer. And this takes place in the city of New Crobuzon, and we follow at first 2 characters of Isaac and Lynn. Isaac is a human scientist working on a chaos theory who is approached by a Garuda. If I'm pronouncing that right, it might be Garuda. I can't really remember at this point. This is the second time I've had to film this review, because the first time my audio cord was unplugged. But is approached by a stranger, and that stranger is of the Garuda race, and needs to help them, has decided to help them, I should say. And that leads them down a very interesting path. And then you have Lynn, who is a Khepri, one of the many different kinds of species or races that you will see in this city. And Khepris have carapace heads. Also, Khepri was an Egyptian god with a scarab-like head that brought about creation and new life and almost like revival in some ways, which is interesting because Lynn is not only Isaac's romantic interest, but also an artist. And artists do bring things to life, do they not? Creation is a part of that process. And you will see in this book that Lynn is definitely conflicted of where she stands in this city and overall society, because the Khepri, there's biases against them, and it's unfortunate, and she feels those. She actually goes through some of that turmoil herself, but then you see her, and this is why she was just immediately one of my favorite characters, and probably my favorite character in the entire book. Lynn is in a pious section of New Crobuzon and seeing all the other Khepri, and she almost looks down upon them for living a traditional lifestyle that the Khepri have lived for many generations. She almost pities them in a way. And so now she feels not like she fits in with her people, the Khepri, and doesn't feel like she fits in other parts of the city. So that makes for a very complex character in a complex city, in a very complex plot, because she ends up taking a job from a client to create some art that she should have never agreed to. And I'm going to leave the premise at that. You have a scientist trying to achieve a great thing and also trying to help someone, and then you have an artist that takes on a risky client. And New Crobuzon itself is a bit of a character and a mystery piece in the story, because it is so vast and has different sections, and they all really do come to life when you visit them on their page or they are mentioned. I will say the scope of this city is supposed to have 3 million inhabitants. I never felt that scope, and I would say that's one of the things where this book failed me a little bit, is that I never felt that wide-ranging scope. And part of that's because as you go through this book, you will see that things will intertwine, things will end up popping in that were mentioned a little bit prior. A lot of characters cross paths, because there are many more POVs actually featured in this book than the 2 I mentioned, but that's a good starting point just to kind of give a no-spoiler overview. But they intersect, they cross, things end up meeting in the middle a lot. And when you do that, sometimes a world can feel a little bit smaller. Now, I'm saying world, but this is really a city. New Crobuzon is one place in a larger world. So I think it's okay. And definitely the setting itself comes alive and comes off the page because China Mieville knows how to write some descriptions, let me tell you. But there were times where I felt like the scope could have felt more grandioso, and that was one of the things that did bother me a little bit about this book. However, from the city to the races, the characters, everything, this feels like an imagination unleashed, an imagination unbound. China Mieville, I don't know what's going on in his head. This is his second book, I believe, that he wrote, and the first one of this length. And for him to go for it on this scale and to be so creative, I just gotta really give it up to him. This city has steampunk type of technology, but there's also magic. There's a lot here, and it's really, really weird. The Khepri, I kind of mentioned him earlier, but I never described what Lynn looks like. So Lynn is a human all the way up to her neck. I like it. Well, hold on, I'm not done. But also has a scarab type head. So I almost imagine her with like an ant for a head, which I don't think is exactly how they're described here in the book, but that is how it was pictured in my head. And then you have the Gerudo, which for all intents and purposes make me feel like they look like Big Bird, which is not the case at all. They actually have like an eagle type head. That's one thing about this is like, I've never really seen anything like this. Now, the races and symbolism and even the descriptions are inspired by Hinduism, Egyptian gods, all of these other things. So it's not like the fact that he's running with things. He's taking a idea or something from the past, and then he's adding on to it, putting his own twist, and that is what makes this really original. And also seeing all these type of creatures and races in this setting in a city that, honest to God, feels so intoxicating to read about. I feel like I have been there. I can feel the film on my skin. I feel like I can smell this city. So when you bring in all these really, 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 really interesting races, characters, and throw them in this city, you have a big ball of weird. George R. R. Martin has mentioned this whenever speaking about horror, sci-fi, and fantasy as genres and how they kind of intertwine. He said that he believes that they're all rooms in the same house. I love that quote, and I will use that a lot of the times when I'm talking about reviews because the books that I find to be great, not all, but many of them, are the ones who figure out how to combine those three elements. And China Mieville and Perdido Street Station took everybody out of the rooms, brought them down into the kitchen, and then he just started making a big bag of weird. And that's the only way to really describe this. It's hard to really put your finger on one element of this book that doesn't feel just out of this world and chaotic. For instance, we have the concept of people in the city. They are remade, and they are almost like these bastardized technological biomutants in a way. And essentially they take criminals and they remake them by giving them modifications, whether it be with tech or other weird pseudo-biological changes. I mean, it's really messed up stuff. If you listen to this quote from the book, it can kind of give you an idea of how grim things can really get. And this is, edging into that horror side of things. The quote goes like this: Isaac quietly greeted the old man by the door, Joshua, whose remaking had been very small and very cruel. A failed burglar, he had refused to testify against his gang, and the magister had ordered his silence made permanent. He had his mouth taken away, sealed with a seamless stretch of flesh. Rather than live on tubes of soup pushed through his nose, Joshua had sliced himself a new mouth, but the pain had made him tremble, and it was a ragged, torn, unfinished-looking thing, a flaccid wound. That is terrifying, horrifying stuff, and extraordinarily brutal. So you can see that this isn't just a fun city. When I said I would visit, I think I would like to maybe pass by on a train, maybe. I don't know if I would necessarily want to stop in this city. Because it is brutal. The government that is in place has a militia, and they are overlords, and they rule with an iron fist, and that comes into play in the story a bunch. There's a lot of bucking back against authority, which is interesting because I also feel like this book kind of bucks back against what fantasy can be in the genre, and those two things parallel very nicely, especially whenever this was written. people have told me when they read this that they realize what fantasy really could entail and the range that it has as a genre. And I agree with that. And when dealing with so many different facets of speculative fiction and things that make this story very, very weird, there's also an approach to the writing that, like I have said already, comes across as chaotic, but sometimes comes across so well executed and beautiful. It's really remarkable. For instance, Yagarek is one of the Garuda. He is the Garuda that comes to Isaac for help. And the bias against this species or race is the fact that they are dumb. I mean, they're not literate. Surely they don't have books, which Isaac finds out is not correct. Yagarek actually is pretty well spoken, and his people have a traveling library, and they're a lot more complex than it would seem on the surface. And this is taken to another step with the writing and the prose that China Mieville goes with the style. And that is the fact that we actually get these little epigraphs you could say at the ending of a section or beginning, whichever way you want to look at it, but they're epigraphs written from Yagarek's POV. And they're beautifully written. Some of the best lines in the book actually come from that POV, and you realize that the Garudas are not some barbarian race or they're not illiterate. They're actually really, really amazing and kind of majestic in a way. And not just physically, because they obviously have amazing description in the book, but also intellectually. And I think that POV has a prose change where China Mieville changes the way he's writing. He even changes the perspective, and it comes across so well to execute what we saw get defeated as a bias in Isaac's POV. So we're playing with perspective, we're playing with different writing styles, and it comes across beautifully. And that's the thing. This book does have some flaws, but those flaws somehow enhance the overall vibe of this story, of it being just wild. Things that I would say about this story, I've kind of already mentioned a couple of them, but things that didn't work for me, there was a little bit of padding, it felt like, towards the end of the book, but it didn't feel so egregious because I was really meshing with the writing style. There's a lot of exposition, and for good reason. This is not the most in-depth lore or world building of all time, but it is impressive with just how wide it goes and enough details to make it feel real and make it feel like this is a place that exists out in the ethos. So I think that is pretty impressive, but it does come with some heavy-handed exposition. We actually take an entire chapter off to kind of get Lynn's backstory, which I didn't mind so much because I'm a Lynn fan. I think some readers will notice that. Also, the pace is very, very hectic at times. The first half of the book almost settles in with Isaac and Lynn, and you think it's going to be this little slice of life, but then we expand out with POVs, and it really kicks into second gear after part 2, and the back half of the book is just like a banger. I mean, it had my blood pumping, but it tended to go in and out of focus, and different characters came in and out of focus, and there was an absence of a POV in the second half of this book that really bothered me because I felt like that POV was lifting up half of the book, really, and keeping it very, very interesting. And I thought that POV was more compelling than the one that we ended up sticking with more so for a lot of the story. But those are all choices that the author has made. And, some of them bother me, some of them don't. I think it'll be a varying experience across readers. As I've seen in reviews already, I think this sits just beneath a 4-star on Goodreads, which doesn't mean that it's bad, by the way. Goodreads ratings are strange, but when I see something in that 3-5 range or like upper 3s, I'm always like, oh, there's a lot of 5 and 1s. And that does not surprise me because, all of the amazing imagination put into this, all of the weirdness, the really well-crafted characters, this is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But the one thing I can guarantee you if you read Perdido Street Station is that you will have something to say about this book. I don't believe that this is a book that you close the last page on. Now, if you DNF it, maybe, but if you finish this book, I feel like there's no way you walk out of it not having an opinion one way or another with a lot to say. And that is because with that gear shift that we get into the second half of the book, we come to a conclusion in Perdido Street Station that has left me conflicted, that has made me feel very odd. I feel different about everything that I read prior to the final chapter. I feel different about characters than I did in the final chapter. And I don't know if everything was executed as well as it should have been. I don't know if I necessarily love some of the decisions made, but without a doubt has been weighing on my heart and my brain all day. I finished it this morning. I filmed a 45-minute review, forgot to plug in the audio, and then I'm filming this again. Just so you know, there's been times where I've done this, and then I don't refilm the review. I just said, well, I'm never reviewing that book. I could not do that with this book. This book there's too much. It's really impressive that he fit that much into a 700-page book. I'm so impressed by it, not just for the, a lot of the original thought, but also things to digest, things to download. And I have to be very, very careful about what I say here because I don't want to spoil anything for anyone. But the final chapter of this book hits so damn hard and will leave so many people split that I just have to know what you think about it. If you did read this book, let me know down in the comments. Please spoiler tag and leave some spaces between, though, because I don't want to spoil anyone else. And if you end up reading this book, I want you to come back to this video if you could. And let me know what you think about it, because I've never read a book that just left me so unsure of how I feel. But I think I loved it because whenever this kind of thing happens, it makes me want to talk about it. It gets me excited to get in front of the camera. It gets me excited to talk about it with my friends. And it makes me want to read more of China Mieville. I wonder if, because I've heard that his other books are much tighter, that he really starts to tighten up the craft and the plot isn't as chaotic and everything else. I've said the word chaotic so many times, but if you read the book, I think you'll understand. Because even though you can see a lot of the raw effort that was put into this book, and some of it isn't a complete fleshed out landing, it adds to the charm of the grunginess, of the buck back, the counterculture feel I get from this book for whatever reason. And that's just how I feel. It feels like the mistakes fit the style, which maybe I'm giving him a pass. Maybe that is a pass, but that's just how I feel. And when I'm talking about shifting into second gear into the second half of this book, I don't want you to think that this is some like action-packed, like blockbuster. It's not that. Actually, some of my favorite moments in this book were just seeing characters that range from horrifying to hilarious and just outright odd, and them coming together in a scene and having a conversation. Like, you're like, oh, these characters are so powerful even. When they get into the same room, what is going to happen? There's like this dread anticipation of knowing things are about to go down in this book that just happened from two characters having a conversation, which I freaking loved. I am so surprised that I like this book because with the little bit of steampunk aesthetic that this has, which, by the way, I'm not a huge fan of steampunk, and this is not just a steampunk novel. Don't think that. It's just one part of the many layers and pieces of this puzzle that creates this wonderful book. But I don't really like steampunk aesthetic, and I don't really like the grimy city feel most of the time. And another, not bias, but limitation I have as a reader is that I am not very visual at all. So a book that is packed with such a described city and a big, big cast of different races that are wild eagle heads, there's cactus people, there's people who have like water around them that can form. I mean, wild stuff, okay? No shortage of all that. There's a lot of stuff to visualize when you read this. Like if you were a visual reader that paints portraits in your head when you read, if you're really, really visual, this book is going to scratch that itch maybe the best ever. Like it's that well written when it comes to descriptions and just beautiful. I am not that person. I have a really, really hard time. I end up making weird connections of like pictures in my brain. It just doesn't work that well for me. Like I think the Gerudos look like Big Bird, and they clearly don't, right? And I imagine Lynn just being a human with an ant on her head, which I don't think is technically correct. So not just challenging the fact that the aesthetic isn't exactly what I usually like in a book, but also the fact that this is kind of garnered towards people who are visual readers. I was just surprised with how much I loved it and how easy I found it to read. Now, I did have to slow down. I did have to take my time because I'm not visual. So I really put in extra effort to engage with this book, and I think that's why I got a lot out of it. I had to take my time and start to try to paint these pictures because the author put in so much effort to do that I felt as the reader it was my responsibility to give it more of a try than usual. And I think slowing down and really savoring the experience and being immersed in the city helped out a ton and overcame two of the biases that I would have had out the gate with this book. So when I think about what surprised me there, it's the fact that it overcame those two biases. So without a doubt in my brain, this is a beautifully written book that has some of the more original ideas or spins on things that come from different type of cultures, and it's all taking place in one of the best fantasy settings that I have ever personally read about, and has an ending that I would hope that you would have to think long and hard about and recontextualize in your brain what you just experienced. I would love to see how people end up after this ending. I promise you this will stay in your brain, because this is going to stay with me for many years to come. If you like this review, you can hit like. If you disliked it, you can hit dislike. If you loved it and you're not subscribed, think about subscribing. I'd love to have you here. I'm going to be reviewing more China Mieville, all types of different books, Culture series by Ian Banks. There's a lot of stuff that I really want to get to. It's Ian Banks, not Ian. Sorry. There is a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. Until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page. And I want to give a big shout out to all my patrons, especially my Kingsguard, my high tier patrons, which are Lauren, Henrik, Kai, Simon, Oscar, Stewart, Stephen R, Ikaika, Amanda, RJ, Shad, Nicoletta, Tanner, Jennifer, Garrix, Frank, Evie, Fever, Welcome to My Mind, Jay, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, Taylor D, Derry, John C, Bass, Mitch, Sebastian, Benjamin, Jobot, Noel, Amanda L, Kyle, C. Scott, and Steve Talks Books. Thank you all so much. You're the best.